When the cornerstone of this building was still new, Thomas Jefferson said, "The execution of our laws is more important than the making of them." I'm E.G. Marshall. Thomas Jefferson would have little notion of just how far the process of American lawmaking would advance in the century and a half that followed, or how complex it would become. Within these walls, Congress still passes our laws, but today, this is only the beginning. Determining how those laws are made workable is not the job of Congress. This task falls to a powerful but little-known group of bureaucrats called regulators. To some, they are more powerful than many of the lawmakers themselves. What they do affects nearly every part of our daily lives and has become one of the most hotly debated aspects of government today. Our story begins in 1980, the last year of the Carter administration. In a residential section of the nation's capital, David Hawkins begins his daily commute. Hawkins is a federal regulator for the Environmental Protection Agency. His job, like the ever-changing face of this city, is the result of the relentless growth of our government. A century ago, it was relatively simple. Under the great Capitol dome, laws were passed and the nation followed. But today, our laws are many and complex. Every morning, this city's grand avenues are filled with an army of 100,000 federal workers, regulators whose sole task is to implement and enforce the will of Congress. To those who defend it, regulation is an absolute necessity in making a modern society run. But to its detractors, these agencies represent a bureaucratic monster that generates thousands of unnecessary rules, producing a stranglehold on our economy, our lives, even the very air we breathe. A political appointee of the Carter White House, Hawkins was chosen to regulate our nation's air pollution laws. He will be a key figure in a clean air battle to unfold in the months ahead. A lifelong environmentalist, he has strong opinions on our government's obligations.
Regulation has tended to be developed in response to abuse. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was a response to horrors in the food industry. Securities laws were a response to people losing their shirts in the stock market. It's easy to say you're in favor of less regulation, but if you ask somebody, are you in favor of dirtier air, they usually say, no, we're not in favor of dirtier air. These programs are finally beginning to work. They're actually causing people to have to spend money cleaning up what they've been putting into the air for free all these years.
Get it down, because the meeting on everybody's standards is taking place on Friday.
Right.
So, but they have to put together...
As Hawkins Day begins at the Environmental Protection Agency, so does that of a natural adversary across town.
Hunton and Williams. One moment, please.
Henry Nickel is a lawyer for an industry which feels the full weight of David Hawkins' clean air regulations. He is the Washington representative for a large group of electrical power producers located in the West. To Nickel, regulation creates as many problems as it solves.
Because the utility industry is building and operating very large industrial facilities which produce a great deal of energy and therefore require the use of a great deal of fuels, they are number one on the list, oftentimes, for regulation. The principal problem is the atmosphere of uncertainty that exists. You're talking about investments of hundreds of millions of dollars. And every time they build a plant, all of the environmental requirements that applied to the last plant they built, in all likelihood, have been changed.
In the next 2 decades, electrical power demands in the nation will double. As the population grows, so does the real threat of a future energy crisis.
We need energy to run our economy, and any regulatory action that can affect that
must be very carefully considered in light of the key importance of developing an energy independence.
And in the American West are possible solutions to our energy problems for the next 200 years. Coal for electricity and synthetic fuels. Shale to release the U.S. from its crippling dependence on foreign oil. But there is a problem. Facilities to convert these riches will seriously threaten another resource, one serving the human spirit.
The national parks are really held as something sacred. I don't remember whom, but someone referred to the national parks as islands of hope.
In Washington, Barbara Brown, the chief of air quality for our national parks, is concerned. The government will soon be inundated with some 90 new permits to locate power plants and strip mines in the very shadow of the parks. The clean air battle that threatens may be the biggest of her new career.
What really brought me to this job was that I took a backpacking trip for the first time in my life and went out to Canyonlands, Bryce Canyon National Park, Zion, the Grand Canyon, and I was totally stunned by its beauty. The Grand Canyon is there because it's a natural scenic wonder. I've seen it when it's crystal clear and all the colors just shimmer, and I've seen it when it's very difficult to even see a rock on the other side of the gorge. Air pollution is probably the #1 threat to our national parks. There's a problem out there, and if something isn't done about it, there may not be national parks as we know them today.
One of the first to see the problem is a former park ranger, now naturalist photographer, Gordon Anderson. From a remote corner of Bryce Canyon, Utah, his is a lone voice from the wilderness.
Throughout the year, I make several trips to Bryce Canyon National Park to photograph, but my favorite time to visit this spectacular park is in the winter. A blanket of snow adds a new dimension to the colors here in the canyon. When the founding fathers of the National Park System back in 1916 set aside parks to be preserved, they could not anticipate that 50 years later, these parks would be threatened by enormous coal-burning power plants operating just outside their boundaries.
Anderson had been taking pictures of the western parks for years. As time progressed, he felt that his photographs were revealing an increasing amount of visible air pollution entering from nearby power plants. Could these scenic wonders survive the effects of large-scale future energy development? 5 years before, in the fall of 1975, he began a one-man crusade to save these natural treasures. In our nation's capital, with the help of a small band of environmentalists, Friends of the Earth, Anderson brought his photographic evidence to petition Congress. The goal of this citizens' lobbying effort, find a key legislator who would help.
How are you this morning?
Congressman Paul Rogers, an author of the monumental 1970 Clean Air Act, was now revising that law. Although a great deal had been accomplished in cleaning up the nation's air, the Anderson slides were alarming evidence that the parks were still unprotected.
This is the Navajo power plant in 1974. We flew over the plant to photograph the plume from the air, and smoke was blowing into the Grand Canyon. When this happens, the vistas are now reduced to less than the width of the canyon. When pollution finds its way into this huge basin, the view becomes something more like this. This is Candlestick Peak. On the day when it's being impacted by air pollution from power plants, it looks more like this.
In December of 1976, Rogers and his staff went west to see for themselves. Here they experienced the rugged beauty of our national parks, and followed a trail of pollution that led from the Grand Canyon to the massive Navajo power plant 50 miles to the north. From the Four Corners plant, they saw a screen of sulfates and nitrates that nearly obliterated Shiprock Monument in the Navajo reservation. To the lawmakers, the nation's energy needs were clearly conflicting with another national value, the preservation of our parks as we know them.
I'm not sure that the monitoring that you did is necessarily all natural. In other words, it could well be man-made as well, could it not? So
in the process of amending over 100 new sections of the Clean Air Act, one section would read, Congress hereby declares as a national goal the prevention of any future and the remedying of any existing impairment of visibility within our national park areas. This part of the Clean Air Law is Section 169A. Its final passage is swift.
All in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. It's carried, and there's agreement.
21-22. But the process does not end here. Congress has neither the technical knowledge nor the staff to turn its desires into reality. This is where the regulators take over. Those scores of agencies formed by Congress in the past century to implement and enforce the will of the legislators. Formed in 1970, EPA was given the mandate to mount an attack on the sources of pollution of our nation's air and water. One of the newest and the largest of the regulatory agencies, EPA will regulate all sections of the Clean Air Law. Our story deals with one small part of this law, the threat of air pollution in our national parks. But since the lands near the parks are rich in resources needed for an energy-hungry America, regulation here sets the stage for a classic struggle between government and free enterprise. Ultimate decisions to shape the regulation from this point will be made by David Hawkins. As Chief of Air Pollution Programs for EPA, his task is to implement the intent of Congress. But the Clean Air Law has swamped his office with work, and while nearly 100 new sections must be regulated, clean air in the parks is left untouched for over 2 years. To get things moving again, Gordon Anderson and Friends of the Earth take the matter to federal court. The judge orders EPA to draft a proposed regulation within 6 months and to complete the job in 1 year. Ordinarily, the task should take twice that long.
Next issue is the definition of visibility impairment.
With his environmentalist sympathies, Hawkins will want a strong interpretation of the law, one that in his eyes will achieve effective results.
Is it really likely to require that much time?
With a vaguely worded statute, such as this one, to many, he becomes the real lawmaker.
When a group of people start to think about the actual details of translating a law into specific requirements, questions often come up, and it's my job to provide those answers. And the approach that I took was we're implementing a Clean Air Act, and when in doubt, we should be protecting the environment.
Dave Hawkins' power at this moment is of real concern to Henry Nickel. He knows that one reading of the law could cost his clients $90 million for pollution controls. A stricter interpretation might force them to spend as much as $3 billion.
The way Congress writes laws, they're not models of clarity. Now, most lawyers would strenuously deny this. But the fact is that there really are a spectrum of interpretations. And so you want to look at the facts and pick one that makes the most sense. Our procedural posture will be in the rebuttal and supplemental comments.
The sad part about it is that it probably is easier to identify the need to start a program than it is to figure out how to implement it.
I recognize that
in their stand against Hawkins, the upcoming months will bring intense activity for Nickel and staff. To modify the regulation, he will form alliances with sympathetic government agencies and members of Congress. For the court battles he will create to delay or even kill the rule, he must constantly sift through all available evidence. To the utilities, more regulation could mean delays in constructing new facilities, huge additional costs, and a climate of uncertainty caused by changing rules.
The regulations in question would affect the licensing of every new major facility in the West, and if industry doesn't participate, they are going to find themselves facing rules that cannot be met.
At National Park Service headquarters, there is worry that future energy development will bring more air pollution within the parks.
To the courts. If the courts are going to overturn it, fine, then that's the opportunity to look towards alternative ways of addressing protection. And I'd be very interested to hear what...
Barbara Brown must map a strategy for the months ahead. Her immediate problem is that the National Park Service is not a regulatory agency. She and her staff will have to fight even to be heard.
You work very closely. I knew that it would be a feat of Hercules if a good regulation was written within a year, but I also think it was a wonderful incentive to get moving.
Durham, North Carolina. To the EPA's Office of Air Quality come representatives of the Park Service, the Department of Energy, the Forest Service, and others in the government's first attempt to write the regulation.
I want to try to start at the front and just work our way through. And
the working group is made up of those who must live with the rule after it is regulated. They must draft a proposed regulation within 6 months, but it soon becomes evident that each member brings separate marching orders from his own agency.
The starting place is what's significant, what's worth spending some money on. Now, that means that there has to be a significant improvement.
No, it's going to provide criteria, not necessarily. If we were going to assess public enjoyment of the Vista, we would be doing visitor counts.
It's much broader.
It's much broader, yeah. It's other things. It's whether or not it's a traditional view.
EPA engineer Johnny Pearson is chairman of the working group. A 10-year career bureaucrat with EPA, this is his first chance to head up the writing of a regulation.
That's established for the National Forest System. Visibility is another resource to manage like all the other ones. It's not a unique or special or other.
It's not whether the vista is protected, it's how much protection it gets. That's the
Congress, I think, set the value on visibility.
The working group will be aided by public input. Soon, in 3 western states, workshops will be held to seek initial reaction to the problems of regulating visible pollution within the parks. In Denver, the energy industry voices its candid opinion.
I don't give a damn what the visibility is on the day that I starve to death.
Congress never envisioned these kinds of burdensome costs.
When it becomes impractical for producers to operate, we're on the road to ruin.
EPA's report to Congress protecting visibility points out the need for substantially more
utilities and others remind EPA that the Clean Air Act was to them one of the most burdensome and costly public laws in history. They agree that America's air is now cleaner, but to them, this regulation would only duplicate existing rules and create more paperwork and red tape.
Proposed controls simply result in wheel spinning and in more and more control by inexperienced and unknowledgeable bureaucrats who love to spend money upon the impossible.
We have a power plant up for permitting that's 12 times cleaner than what was presented to the Congress. And they're telling us that we don't meet the Class 2 increments. We have to do a little bit more.
My name is Gordon Anderson, person that showed the slideshow to Congress that inspired this legislation.
As usual, the regulated industry shows up in force. One of 2 who speaks for the environment is Gordon Anderson.
Out here all day listening to people condemn the Environmental Protection Agency. We should be complimenting these individuals on their efforts to protect and clean up the environment. And the reason that they have been criticized by industry is because the intent of industry is to weaken and destroy the provisions of this act. What good is a national park if it's full of smog? What good is the Grand Canyon when you can only see 15 miles because of the Navajo power plant plumes filled the entire Grand Canyon with smog? And this is one of the most important resources not only in America, but in the world. And it's no way to treat it.
What we're saying here is to do the best job we can right now. So we cut back to what we think we can accomplish, recognizing all the limitations. And that may be the control of 3 power plants and 1 kraft pulp mill and 1 cement plant or something, and the consideration of these long-term strategies which will begin to look at, well, what are my other problems?
As time pressures mount, Johnny Pearson asks the working group to limit its efforts to industries already polluting the parks. He suggests that the group ignore, for now, future pollution sources. But before rules can be written, definitions must be reached.
define here is what is that national goal? It says any perceptible change related to that from the human observer, from that which would have existed in natural conditions.
But then you have to define what natural conditions are.
I think that's important. You have to define what
Well, I don't think we can define natural conditions.
But then that's meaningless.
Second of all, what we're looking for is cases where it's obviously not natural conditions.
If you don't put that in there, you could go to, you know, the LA Basin and you could put up a plume there and somebody could say, well, look, you can't see it because the LA smog is in your eyes, so you can't see the plume, so why can't I build my source? And we're saying you can't do that.
When you ask that source to calculate his impact on the existing natural conditions, what are you going to tell him natural conditions are?
It's natural conditions, that which occurs naturally. You can't define a natural condition as a number.
We have to look.
The simple intent of the United States Congress to clean the air within our national parks begins to appear unsolvable for many reasons.
We're looking towards the Henry Mountains, out of Capitol Reef, and we have a hypothetical plan.
Existing means of scientific measurement are not designed for situations of this complexity. Clearly, area power plants are not the only polluters. Smelters and other industries add to the picture, as do urban centers as far away as Los Angeles. Wind conditions change hourly, defying accurate monitoring of pollution sources. Finally, one thing overlooked by Congress. Much of the scenery observed by visitors lies outside park boundaries. Should not these integral vistas, as the bureaucrats would call them, also be protected? Yet, there are hundreds of these magnificent views adjacent to the parks. Limiting development of these lands would certainly be opposed by industry. With all of these problems, there is still the pressure of the first court deadline, in which a proposed regulation must be ready for review by May 15th. Johnny Pearson makes the decision. His first draft will ignore future sources and regulate existing polluters only, a step not popular with Park Service officials in Washington.
It was a very aggravating process at times when you said something over and over and they said, gotcha, and then it wasn't what you really were saying at all.
They just don't make the state or the applicant accountable.
When you care about what you're doing, you identify very personally with the product that you see on paper. It isn't just a regulation. It means, will people see the Grand Canyon 100 years from now?
Yeah. I have seen such gobbledygook before, but I'm surprised at this stage that it's still gobbledygook. Yeah.
It's still better than it was.
There are sentences that aren't even sentences.
Yeah.
I began to feel like a manic depressive on a roller coaster.
Across town, the environmental activist group Friends of the Earth received copies of the draft leaked to them by allies within the Park Service.
80 pages from EPA, the second cut on the regulations. Quite frankly, it's pitiful. Doesn't mention anything about new sources at all.
We've got to raise the issue. That's our responsibility.
You could not intelligently evaluate what the agency was proposing because the agency hadn't given us all of the information that we needed to make a judgment.
And information is the lifeblood to Henry Nickel in preparing a strong legal case. He invokes the Freedom of Information Act, dispatching a team of attorneys to search Park Service files.
The sort of thing we're looking for, what is known about the Class 1 areas and how.
These were a general first cut.
Sure.
To give you an idea.
We'll probably finish relatively early.
Well,
we will
have at
To read all this, you'd be qualified to work for a travel agency.
In Utah. Say the principal source of impairment is the Navajo plant.
Could you clip this up?
You're doing all of this with an eye ultimately to the courts, because if you don't get what you want, you have to go to court or forever waive any right that you have to be heard on that question. Of course, the history of the last several years is that the ultimate decision upsets everybody.
I've never been.